what Senator Shelby had in mind, but not, if I can put it this way, overdo it in a way that will actually, according to comments we've had from people in the executive branch, get in the way of the existing very tough ethics rules that they live under now. I'd yield the floor at this point.
Senator from Maine.
Madam President. Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, first let me commend the chairman of our committee, Senator Lieberman. As always, it's been a great pleasure to work with him to produce this bill. I also want to commend the author of the bill, Senator Scott Brown, who was the first to introduce this legislation in the Senate, and also praise the work of the senator from New York, Senator Gillibrand, for her contributions. The Stock Act is intended to affirm that members of Congress are not exempt from our laws prohibiting insider trading. Now, there are disputes among the experts about whether or not this legislation is necessary, but we feel that we should send a very strong message to the American public that we understand that members of Congress are not exempt from insider trading laws, and that is exactly what this bill does. We need to reassure a skeptical public that we understand that elective office is a place for public service, not for private gain. Underscoring that important message is clearly the purpose of this bill, and that is why I support it. Thank you, Madam President.
Under the previous order, the following amendments are withdrawn. Amendment number 1478, Amendment number 1477, Amendment number 1474, Amendment number 1476, Amendment number 1490, Amendment number 1492, and Amendment number 1503. Under the previous order, the question occurs on Amendment number 1482, offered by the Senator from Connecticut, Mr. Lieberman.
Madam President, this is a highly technical amendment. It simply says that the GAO report required by the underlying bill on the question of political intelligence be sent not only to the Committee on Government Oversight in the House, but also to the Judiciary Committee. And if there's no objection now, Mr. President, I would move adoption of the amendment. I don't believe there's any opposition, and therefore no need for a roll call.
Is there objection?
Is there further debate?
Is there further debate?
Not all in favor, say aye.
If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question occurs on the Paul Amendment number 1484. There are 2 minutes of debate equally divided on this amendment.
Mr. President, I don't see the senator from he is here.
Mr. President, Senator from Kentucky.
I rise today in support of this amendment. This amendment would strike the underlying bill and would replace it with an affirmation that we are not exempt from insider trading, and that each senator would sign a statement each year affirming that they did not participate in insider trading. I think this is the way to go. I think the American people want to be sure that we are not exempt, and I think this is a good way to do it without creating a bureaucracy and a nightmare that may well have many unintended consequences.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, I respectfully oppose the amendment. It would, as the senator from Kentucky, with his characteristic directness, said, strike the entire bill. And the affirmation by members that they have not violated insider trading laws is, in my opinion, not enough. And in the opinion of the SEC, it's not enough because it doesn't establish the duty of trust that this underlying bill does that is required to guarantee that charges against a member of Congress or staff on insider trading will not be successfully defended against because on the argument that members are not covered. So I would yield the rest of my time to my friend from Maine.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I, too, am opposed to the amendment offered by Senator Paul. I do think the idea of a certification is a good one, but unfortunately Senator Paul's bill, or his amendment, would strike the provisions of the bill that affirm the duty that we have to the American people. And the scholars who testified before the committee said that was necessary.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayat, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Carey. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Blunt, Cornyn, DeMint, Graham, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kyle, Paul, and Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Bingaman, Blumenthal, Brown of Massachusetts, Cardin, Cochran, Durbin, Franken, Gillibrand, Kerry, Cole, Lautenberg, Lieberman, McCaskill, Murkowski, Reed of Rhode Island, Sanders, Vitter, and Whitehouse. Mr. Coburn, aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Conrad, aye. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Reed of Nevada, no. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Florida, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mrs. Hutchison. Mrs. Hutchison, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Isaacson, no. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Lugar, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, no. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Johans, no. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Florida, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, no. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Inouye, no. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan, no. McCain. Mr. McCain, no. Ms. Snow, no. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, no. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, no. Mr. Webb. Mr. Webb, aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Cole. Patty. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado, no. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, aye. Mr. Akaka. Mr. Akaka, no. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mrs. Boxer, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Begich, aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Chambliss, aye.
I don't know which part, she's in the drawer or the push-up. She's just playing around on the floor.
Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown of Ohio, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Roberts, aye. Cochran. Mr. Cochran. Aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune. Aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, no. Oh, it is? Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Pryor, no. Yes. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, no. Mr. Merkley, no.
Are there any senators who have not yet voted or wish to change their vote?
Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mrs. McCaskill. No.
Are there any senators who have not yet voted or wish to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the ayes are 37, the nays are 61. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President, I move for reconsideration.
Without objection.
Thank you, Chair.
Table. Mr. President, I move to lay it on
Without
the table.
objection. Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote in relation to amendment number 1487 offered by the senator from Kentucky, Mr. Paul. This amendment is subject to a 60-vote threshold. Senate will be in order.
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
this amendment would say that the executive branch
Senate will be in order.
This amendment would say that those in the executive branch who decide loans and grants, if they have a self-interest in the company or their family has a self-interest in the company, that they should not be making decisions awarding grants and awarding loans. I think the idea that you should not make money off of government is an important one, but it's not just Congress that this should apply to. This should apply to the executive branch, and we should not have hundreds of millions of dollars in loans, even billions of dollars in loans, dispensed by people who used to work for that company or whose family still works for that company. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, this is one of a series of amendments in which our colleagues are applying ethics rules to the executive branch, although the bill is focused, of course, on the members of Congress. In this case, this applies probably the harshest penalty that has ever been applied to members of the executive branch. The fact is that executive branch employees are already subject to an effective, in some ways, broader ethics regime than we face now, and it's backed up by criminal sanctions. As an example, executive branch employees file financial disclosure forms. The agency ethics officials who examine them can compel divestiture of holdings. They can require the individual to recuse himself from certain matters, and if recusal is not sufficient, the agency can reassign the individual. Yeah, and in this case, Senator Paul would say that an executive branch employee is forbidden from holding a position in which they or their family have any financial interest of $5,000 or more. So I oppose the amendment.
The question is on the amendment.
The yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Lieberman. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckidge. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. More purple barley. Mr. Coburn.
I still work for the minimum.
Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Carey, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cornyn, Crapo, DeMint, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hutchison, Isaacson, Klobuchar, Kyle, Lee, Lugar, McCain, McCaskill, McConnell, Moran, Nelson, Nebraska, Paul, Risch, Roberts, Sessions, Shelby, Stabenow, Toomey, and Vitter. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Nelson of Florida, aye. Ms. Snow, aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Baucus, Beckidge, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Cardin, Carper, Cochran, Collins, Conrad, Durbin, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Hoban, Inouye, Johans, Kerry, Cole, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Lieberman, Manchin, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murray, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Shaheen, Tester, Warner, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Wyden. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, no. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall, Colorado, no. Mr. Bennett? Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, no. Mr. Casey? Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Webb, no. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Schumer, no.
Is there any senator who has not yet voted or wishes to change his or her vote?
Mr. Carper, aye.
Is there any senator who wishes to change his or her vote who has not yet voted? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 48, the nays are 51. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President, I move to reconsider.
Mr. President, I move to lay it on the table.
Without objection. Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote in relation to amendment number 1511, offered by the senator from Connecticut, Mr. Lieberman.
I thank the chair. Mr. President, this is a...
Senate will be in order. Senator from Connecticut.
I thank the chair. Mr. President, this is a side-by-side with an amendment offered by my friend from Alabama. The question is, how many of the employees of the executive branch of government should be required to electronically file their disclosure statements? I believe respectfully that Senator Shelby's amendment requires almost maybe more than 300,000 federal employees, including many who file confidential disclosure statements. Our amendment, this amendment, would include people in the federal executive branch who hold positions most equivalent to those of us in Congress who are policy makers. And that includes the President, the Vice President, appointees in the White House, members of the Federal Reserve Board, senior executive service. It's a difference between applying this requirement to 2,000 executive branch employees or more than 300,000. I yield the remainder of my time to Senator Collins.
No time remaining. Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, can we have order?
Yes. Senate will be in order. Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, the Lieberman amendment, this will be side by side with the Shelby amendment. This Lieberman amendment would create loopholes, disparity, and undermines the true transparency, and I encourage my colleagues to oppose it. On the other hand, my amendment would be side by side and creates parity, fairness, and true transparency. Without transparency, the American people will be left in the dark. Also, he's talking about who would have to file. It's the same people that will have to file disclosures now. Why should they be exempt? My amendment would make a level playing field. It makes a lot of sense. It's fairness, it's honest, and the executive branch should not be excluded for any reason I can think of. Thank you.
Question is on the amendment. Senator, the ayes and nays are asked for. Is there a second? Appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman,
Okay, I don't either. Just making sure we agree. Sorry.
Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Alexander, Ayotte, Begich, Blumenthal, Bozeman, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coates, Collins, Conrad, Cornyn, Crapo, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Klobuchar, Cole, Kyle, Landrieu, Leahy, Lieberman, Manchin, McCain, McCaskill, Merkley, Murkowski, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Reed of Rhode Island, Roberts, Rockefeller, Rubio, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Warner, Webb, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Inouye, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Bingaman, Blunt, Chambliss, Coburn, Dement, Enzi, Lugar, Moran, Portman, Reed of Nevada, Shelby, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker.
That's okay, sir. You've been
Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Lautenberg, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, aye. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Carey, Aye. Mr. Lee? No. Mr. Sessions? Mr. Sessions? No. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin? Aye. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mrs. Hutchison? Mrs. Hutchison? Aye. Mrs. Boxer? Mrs. Boxer? Aye. Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Baucus? Mr. Baucus? Aye. Mr. McConnell? No. Ms. Cantwell? Ms. Cantwell? Aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? Hearing none. The yeas are 81, the nays are 18. The amendment is passed.